Namaste. Good evening, everyone. We welcome you all to our continuing series, Evenings with Sraddhalu. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste. Happy to be with all of you.
Happy to continue our series. And today is part 8 on the same topic, Secrets of Occult Science, with our theme for today, the vision of the future. And we received from some very interesting questions from our viewers. And I will start addressing our first question from Maureen. So Maureen is writing a question. There is a proliferation of narratives on ET encounters, some with little men in varying regalia, memberships in galactic federations, visions of future life on Earth, and so on. Add to this the attention that is given to the predictions of people like Rudolf Steiner and Edgar Cayce. In many instances, these two domains are conflated. Are these perhaps the products of occult forces, often commingling intentionally with unique selling angles? There are also the unique cases of science fiction writers like Philip K. Dick, who may have achieved a kind of a prescience as the result of a cosmic impulse. Perhaps these narratives arrive when there is a collective need for tales that guide in a direction that is needed at a specific time. I would very much appreciate your perspective on this through the eyes of Sri Aurobindo.
It's an interesting question and points to certain trends which are presently very common. We have, as you can see, quite a lot of suggestions of extraterrestrial intelligence, contact with ET life, and so on. Very strongly in the last 50 years, but of recent times, again, it's emerging with some of the media attention that has come. We have also more dramatic forms of these ideas of ETs and contact with ETs through science fiction. Some of it, particularly in the 60s, had taken on a form of the type that Maureen describes. And cinema, TV series, or even cinema series such as Star Wars, which have assisted in visions of extraterrestrial civilizations mingling together as different races. This is one side which Maureen describes. Then there's this other side of predictions of the future, which come from visionaries. Edgar Cayce, Rudolf Steiner are two that she mentions. And then there are the science fiction writers who are equally visionary. She has mentioned Philip Dick, but there is also Arthur C. Clarke, Isaac Asimov. These are very famous science fiction writers who seem to have perceived what the future might be like. Many of the things which they describe, or in a sense foresaw, have actually come to fruition. Others seem to have become as if defined goals for much of the scientific effort and technological development. Arthur C. Clarke, for example, described what are called geostationary satellites, satellites which move at the same pace as the Earth's rotation and so seem to be fixed like stars. And even he had some idea of creating a kind of an elevator that would take you all the way up into space and things like that. All of which on some level seem to be not only possible, but they resonate with some deep intuitive layers within us that makes you feel, yes, of course, it should be like that. So in a sense, they are visionaries who perceive and then give form. And the form then becomes more accessible to the common mind, which mind was already touched by the intuitions, but could not receive the intuitive influence all the way to the surface. And now through cinema or novels, the forms are given in a way that you can seize upon. And it resonates with the intuition, which was nudging you, so to say. And all these things seem to blend And to her question, yes, of course, there is as if a collective need, but more important, there are ideas, or I will use the word divine gifts in a more general way, which are already in the process of manifestation, which are looking for instruments to manifest. Those who can perceive them ahead are the ones who become, therefore, the link points. Often, those who write fiction could be such, if their mind was tuned to the future, and especially to a higher intuitive opening, then they capture this, and then they become a vehicle to bring it down to the level of the mind. And then there are those who catch the mental idea and give to it a vital or physical formation and manifest it. So the science fiction writer such as Jules Verne, for example, going back nearly 150 years, some of the things he foresaw or saw as possibilities did come true later in ways that he could not have imagined. And so, yes, there is an attempt from above to manifest, and then there are receptive elements who pick on various levels to bring it all the way down to something more concrete. There are equally forces in between, all along, who may try to distort, divert, or even block. So if you take the example of electric cars as something which should have been the norm from the very beginning. If you go back to the origin of cars, almost all the initial cars were electric, going back 120 years at least. And then somehow there was this lobby that came, which wanted to push forward the petrol, gasoline, what they call fossil fuels. They are not actually fossil, but anyway, they wanted to push forward the petroleum lobby, and they killed the electric car deliberately. Later attempts to reinstate the electric car again were very successful. There's a whole documentary called Who Killed the Electric Car, which describes how in 1997, 98, I think, GM brought out electric cars. They were so successful that they got scared and pulled it out. And finally, the man who could push through in spite of all these resistances was Elon Musk, who caught that idea. Of course, the technology was there, but then developed it to a level which was so amazingly advanced, in spite of all the resistances, that it could not but be a success. And still he has faced and still continues to face huge oppositions from these lobbies. Now, the lobbies themselves you can see as forces. Behind the individuals are forces which want to prevent a rapid evolutionary push on a material level also. And so it's actually a struggle up there, which is being reflected in and through physical instruments here on Earth. In the science fiction domain, it's a struggle of ideas. In the materialization domain, it's a struggle of a much more tangible influences. And so this is just to give a first backdrop, and I will touch upon all three of these in sequence, perhaps in the reverse sequence. So the role of science fiction writers, in a way, is often like, on a mental level, the role that the rishis played in perceiving a divine spiritual truth and then articulating, giving it a mental form, and then all the way down to a material or life form in humanity to manifest. Something like this, that some of these science fiction writers seem to almost approach not necessarily a great spiritual truth, but certainly an intuitive perception, which then they bring forward and manifest. Philip Dick, for those who may not know, you may not know his name, but you will know a lot of his movies or stories. Total Recall is a movie that was made from his stories. Minority Report, Blade Runner, The Man in the High Castle. These are all coming from him. So it's interesting to see that connection. Arthur C. Clarke was perhaps nowadays not so well known, but at one point he was one of the most prolific. Isaac Asimov actually wrote the 3 laws of robotics, where he describes what is the programming in a robot, the 3 laws on which its entire behavior should be based so that it may not do harm. And what he articulated is so concise, precise, and yet complete, that to this day, no one has been able to improve upon those 3. So in fact, when robots are made which are given a certain reasonable independence of functioning, these three laws of robotics would be as if at the foundation of what they will be programmed with. And this is a man going back 50 years when that kind of robotics was not even conceivable. Yet he caught a great truth and was able to articulate with a brilliant mind and a brilliant imagination. There's a very interesting idea which exists in another fictional work, fantasy work, which is where the lady goes into the earth and she meets some rabbits and things like that. Now, in that story, there is a description of a rabbit who says, "I think of one impossible thing every day before breakfast." When I read that, I thought it was a very useful practice. Okay, you don't have to do it before breakfast, but the idea of thinking out something which you could not have thought of, try it out. It's a very interesting exercise. Because the moment you try to conceive of something which is impossible, you will find what you imagine is always as if made up of things which you already know in varying combinations. Interesting. It always seems to rely on existing knowledge. And then one day you have an experience, or you read something, or you experience something which is outside your domain. You're surprised. And now that fills in a richer aspect of your creative ability. So there's a creation which is made of combinations, but then there is something bypassing that, which glimpses that which is beyond your mind's combinations. And that's when you can glimpse something which you could not have thought of, or even glimpse something which is impossible. And that's an opening to intuition. So in a sense, it's a very useful exercise to plastify the mind, but also to open it to an intuitive sight or an intuitive perception. I'm describing this because for those of you who are so inclined, I would encourage you to read some of these works of science fiction. There was a period, I think, in my late teenage where I was reading 3 to 4 books of science fiction a week, and going on for a couple of years at least, because our library in the ashram had those. Nowadays, the library culture is almost gone. Even when you read online, the full range is not there. So the advantage of a library, you can actually go through books with a physical touch. You take out a book, and before you hold it, you have a feel. You look at the spread of books, and you're as if your mind is attracted, sometimes with an intuition, to some book, and or your hand goes and picks it out, and then you realize, oh, this is what it is. So that you can't do with online purchase. There you have to go by names or by references. So those of you who have the access, do consider going to a library, go to the science fiction section, look around, see what your feel draws you to, pick a book, read a little. And I would recommend authors such as Isaac Asimov and even Arthur C. Clarke. He has much larger novels. Asimov has short stories, which might be more interesting also. But he has this ability of literally pushing the boundaries of your mind, as if you're glimpsing, I could not have thought of that, something impossible, so to say. And the mind becomes more rich, more plastic, more wide, more free at the level of not just visioning, but conceptions, ideas. And with it, your mind becomes more plastic and receptive to a clear intuition that might come. Or remember this phrase, which is one of my favorite from Sri Aurobindo, where he says that we must become plastic to the touch of the infinite. Of course, it must be in all the parts of our being, but for the mind particularly, this kind of plasticity of ideas or of thought is of a tremendous help. Because one of the biggest limitations that prevents us from glimpsing an intuition in its entirety is some existing preconception and rigidity in the mental substance that prevents us from seeing wider. So even when the intuition comes and you say, I've got it, you've not got it entirely. You've got an aspect of it that fitted your expectation, grooves, habits, and so to say, rigidity. When your mind is actually quiet, still, but also plastic, then it can come and flow and create forms richly, widely, in multiple facets. So I'm kind of going off track from the question, but Since it's an opportunity to suggest certain practices, I'm throwing these in. So yes, science fiction writers can actually be, so to say, drashtas, visionaries for the future, or for an intuition of something that is trying to manifest. Then there is a reference to Rudolf Steiner, Edgar Cayce, and I want to make a comment about them also. Edgar Cayce was a brand apart from all these, and of a level of reliability and competence, depth and richness, which is difficult to find. He would go into a state of trance through a process which was almost intuitively known as if a carryover from a past life. And once in the trance, he would speak, there would be questions raised, and they found that he could even make comments about people who were not present. So then people started sending letters, and the letter would say so and so from, and there would be an address. So the questioner would read out, letter from so and so name, and sometimes address. And then in a moment, Cayce would say, yes, I have him before me. And then he would answer the questions, or sometimes begin on his own and describe what the situation was, giving sometimes detailed diagnosis of physical or mental illnesses, and then giving solutions. And the interesting thing is the solutions he gave were so novel to the then culture that many of them could not understand how or why it would work. Then, so there were many questions asking, how does this work? He seems to have given a lot of importance to application of an external poultice, for example, using certain kinds of oils and herbs. And then sometimes he used gems, sometimes he made references to astrological influences, and then he began to speak of past lives, sometimes describing an illness as having a connection with a past life. So all of this became, for those who were following him, something out of the world. To the yoga tradition, it's very familiar, very comfortable even. But coming in that context of what was a very strict and a narrow Christian tradition in which he was saying all these things, it was a bit of a shock. But those who could receive stayed on, and it became for them, he became an occasion for widening their views. So I'm mentioning all this so that you appreciate what is possible also. In one of the questions asked to him about his past, he says that he was trained in this in a prior life in Egypt. And so there's a lot of material that comes regarding ancient Egypt and things which are still hidden in the Great Pyramid, and even about treasures in the world. Sometimes he speaks of locations and he says, in such and such a place, in this mountain, there is enough gold buried, more gold buried than is in circulation in the whole world. And that gives you a clue. Then he speaks of ancient records which are present going back to the time of Atlantis, which would be, let's say, about 10,000 years or 12,000 years. And from that time, there are 3 locations where these records are preserved. One is in Egypt, one is in the Andes mountains, and the third is, of course, in the Himalayas. And he speaks of these things just like that, as if he has access to all kinds of knowledge in the world. Why am I describing this in detail? Because it shows you the ease with which one can have access to such knowledge in a state which is interiorized. It's not even necessarily a spiritual state, but in the inner mind, which opens out to a kind of a universality of knowledge. A little bit of intuition is needed to be able to discriminate and cut through, because often one meets all kinds of, let's say, levels of knowledge. Mother explains this, that especially when you look at the past, you can see not only what actually happened, but what tried to happen, because you're seeing not in the physical level, but in the vital, mental, or other levels. So things which tried to happen physically happened vitally or mentally already before they could happen physically, and they could not reach all the way to the physical. But the imprint of all those things is also there. And how do you distinguish? So a kind of an intuitive development is needed, which would imply a certain spiritual development, which Edgar Cayce did have, and therefore he was able to cut through. He also describes the scene when he is asked a question. He says, it's like I go into a hall where all the records are there. He calls it the Hall of Records. And I pull out from the slot the thing. Now, this is a symbolized representation. because it's obviously not physical partitions made of wood and so on, but it is so to say, a perception of the mind opening to an intuitive domain, and then it perceives it in this way, or rather translates it in its familiar terms. So it's as if, oh, this is what you want to know, and you reach out and grab. And so it gets represented as a hall and so on. But if you cut through the symbolism, it's actually an opening to an intuition, but through the mental consciousness. And therefore, he needed to go into an altered state of consciousness. This is a fascinating example of the kind of knowledge he was able to give out. So he gave things regarding Atlantis and so on, which, of course, the reliability is validated because he was so reliable in other matters, especially of the present and the physical. So in one example, he was asked about the sickness of somebody, and he said, oh yes, this can be cured. And he mentions a medicine, and he says, give this, it will cure him. So they go around looking for the medicine. They come back again and say, we could not find it, it is out of production. So Casey from his trance says, yes, but there's still a bottle available. And he mentions a shop in another city, gives the name of the shop and says, go there, you will still find one bottle. So they go there, the shopkeeper says, yes, we used to have this. He looks around everywhere and says, sorry, we are out of stock. It's so old now, they've stopped long ago, we don't have any bottles left. So the patient comes back to Casey and asks him. Casey says, no, but there is a bottle still left there. Go back into that shop, go to such and such a cupboard. On this particular shelf at the back, you'll find a bottle. And so they go back and they do find the bottle. He takes the medicine and he's cured. Now, this is just to give you an example of the kind of precise knowledge that is accessible. A more developed person in whom the gap between the inner and outer layers was fully bridged, let's say, as the example of the mother of Sri Aurobindo that we know of at least, this kind of access would be spontaneous and wouldn't need to go into a state of trance. So you could go to the mother and say, I need this, where is this? And she would only turn in and say, ah, yes, it is here, this location. She could give you precise knowledge of whatever is required. For those of us who seek to, let's say, develop this opening to the inner mind and the higher intuitive possibilities, it may take a little longer. You will need to, without going into a trance state, you will need to be able to disengage, interiorize your mind, bring it into a certain state of stillness, open out to the intuitive consciousness, and then depending on how much you've familiarized yourself and the skill of receptivity, you will actually be able to reach out and get the specific knowledge that is required. So I know of a few cases of people who could do that, not just in our tradition, but even from other traditions. And sometimes it takes them an hour or so even to get to that point where they can access the knowledge, but then they can get precision with it. All this is to describe a capacity. And of course, he had it in a certain way through the state of trance that he would go into, and he would pull himself out of the state of trance equally. So this is as regards Edgar Casey, very interesting and one of the most educative, if you really study the kinds of medical recommendations he made, discussions of Atlantis or Egypt or ancient history of humanity. He's one of the most reliable and rich sources of the previous cycle of civilization, of which 99.9% is lost because of the passage of, well, destruction, we will say, that the earth had to go through, and the loss of knowledge that came with it. But highly recommended for those who want to explore those different things. Unfortunately, most of the books today brought out by the ARE, which is the institution that publishes his work, are written by people who try to mix in other knowledge. So they will quote from Casey and then give their own interpretations or things they have read from other sources, and that dilutes. If you just read his transcripts, that's much more reliable. So this is as far as Edgar Casey is concerned. There's mention of Rudolf Steiner. He seems to have been an extraordinary genius also. I've seen a little bit of his material, so I will not comment too much because my exposure is limited. But I saw some of his work, of course, on education, very close and parallels Sri Aurobindo's ideas in many ways, and also paralleling Montessori. But he worked in ways which were, and his manner of articulation was also very structured, very clear, clear mind, brilliant intellect. And then I saw some of his work on science, where he speaks of gradations of matter and so on. So all of these match very closely with the physical, with the knowledge we have from the yoga tradition, but he goes into specifics which I had no means to validate. So I will not comment on that. But the fact that he could articulate that itself is quite fascinating. There's only one issue with him, and that has to do more with what he represented as an individual. And it's something Mother mentions in passing, because now this literature is already available in the Mother's agenda. I will read out from it, and it's useful for us to understand, but it is not meant as a criticism, because his work is in fact brilliant. So Mother is speaking in the agenda dated 14th February 1968. And she's speaking of somebody whose picture she was shown, and as it turns out, it refers to one of the Indian gurus who went to the West and became very famous with thousands of disciples. And I will read a little bit of what she says about him, and then finally when she comes to Steiner. She says, "Yesterday I was shown the photo of a man who is the guru of many people. I do not know what he claims to be, but he's an Indian who went to Europe and America and has thousands and thousands of disciples. And he says the only way to bring peace on earth is total and complete freedom, intellectual, moral, vital, physical, and so on." So she describes what he's teaching. And I saw his photo yesterday. Vitally, he is extraordinarily strong. I don't know if it's his own force or if it's what he receives from others, because you can find that out only through physical contact. There are lots and lots of such people now. I've already told you about 3 or 4. Each of them has thousands of followers who probably don't understand anything of what he does. But the impression one gets is of something that works up the dough like this, and she makes a gesture. You catch hold of one tiny bit, one angle. You pierce a kind of a little hole through which you see on the other side. And with that, you stir thousands of people. And she comments, so long as it's not exclusive, that is, so long as the man or woman, the guru, doesn't come and say, I alone am the truth, meaning the others don't know, I alone know. So long as they are not like that, it's quite all right. And when they are enlightened enough to tell you, yes, I've caught hold of one little bit, I'm giving it to you, but all other little bits are good. But even if you put all the bits together, Mother says, you're still far from the truth. Because obviously for that you have to go a little beyond the mind to be able to touch something deeper. So Mother continues, I should have kept that photograph to show you. His body too lives in freedom. Uncombed hair, maybe he never washes, a beard, very strong eyes. Then she makes a very interesting comment now. It's strange. Successful people of this sort are always Indians. Though there was Steiner, who had much power over his disciples, but in his case it was without doubt an adverse force with all the power of the asuras. Just like that, she's making this comment and that's it. So Steiner is one of these very charismatic figures you see, but Mother says it was without doubt an adverse force with all the power of the asuras. I won't comment on it because it's not for me to make an assessment, but the characteristic of the asura is the primary focus on the ego satisfaction of himself. He may have extraordinary knowledge, he may even have a spiritual opening, may bring spiritual knowledge also, but the whole thing is warped around his individual ego objectives. So it need not necessarily distort, or it will warp a little bit, but need not distort the broad framework of the teaching or even forms of practice, need not. It may also. But this is just to convey to you this idea that not everybody who has a glimpse is necessarily pure enough as a transparent instrument that allows the full knowledge to come through without distortion. Many seize upon a higher knowledge and then warp it to suit other objectives. And Steiner seems to have been one such. Nevertheless, you can value the form of education and the practices and the schools that have emerged, which stand independent of whatever he might have been as an individual. Now, I'm giving all this because it points to something important. Mother's comment that there are many people now with this capacity. This is in 1968 that she's saying. And I will link it to another description from Sri Aurobindo, where he refers to this. Now, this goes to a passage that is from one of the talks narrated by or recorded by A.B. Purani in 1925. Goes back quite a bit. And at that time, somebody asked Sri Aurobindo in a conversation. This is before the ashram was formally established, so they had access to Sri Aurobindo quite freely. So somebody asks Sri Aurobindo, how are the universal conditions more ready now for the coming down of the supermind than they were before? Sri Aurobindo made a comment about that before in the conversation. How is it they're more ready? Now, Sri Aurobindo describes four things, four signs. He says, firstly, the knowledge of the physical world has increased so much that it is on the verge of breaking its own bounds. Very interesting idea. The physical world and physical knowledge has reached boundaries where it's crossing the threshold of materiality and entering into subtle physical, vital, and even mental domains. And we see a lot of this in quantum physics as well as other fields, even artificial intelligence. You have to understand the mind's working. You cannot have artificial intelligence which is purely physical. It has to open out to something more, necessarily, you see. So this is first sign. Secondly, there is an attempt all over the world towards breaking the veil between the outer and inner mental, outer and inner vital, and even the outer and the inner physical. Men are becoming more psychic. Now, he uses the word psychic in a more general way, as used in the English language, of opening to inner regions. But the attempt towards breaking this veil he's describing. Remember, this is 1925. And perhaps some other time we will have occasion to explore this more richly. That was a time. I'm going to even describe that period as 1890 to 1930, just before the Second World War, where all over the world this was happening, but especially in Europe, because Europe was seething with new ideas and the glimpses of the future possibilities which we're trying to manifest. It was a relatively free space, and so it was happening in a very strong way. The Theosophical movement and various other groups had come up. Rudolf Steiner himself was known to Madame Blavatsky, broke away and formed his own thing, and so on. A large number of people who were glimpsing possibilities, science fiction writers glimpsing possibilities. There was one writer who wrote a book called The Coming Race. He's trying to conceive of what Sri Aurobindo will later describe as the supramental being, but he sees it through the dark lens of a mental vital construction, exaggerated, which later becomes forms of what you call Superman, Batman comics and the lot. But it's an attempt really to articulate something which is beyond the conception of the mind's capacity. So it's happening everywhere. And in the field of science, these breakthroughs are happening, and they're all pushing the boundaries of the occult. In Europe, it took a form which, as I've mentioned last time, was a bit dangerous, opening to channelings and other worlds and so on, which gets in a dangerous space. But there's a group in Germany which was attempting actually to channel knowledge to create technology. And they received detailed plans and drawings to make a machine which would fly, and it was disc-shaped, was able to create anti-gravity and so on. So they had various terms to describe this. They were using words like the vril and so on, which represented the prana, life force, and so. So it was entering in a domain where matter and the occult were being bridged in a certain way. And it was at that time, approaching the Second World War, that Germany became a hub for this whole opening into what Sri Aurobindo describes as the subjective age. But the false subjectivism of the ego seized this opening. And rather than going to the soul, it was the national ego that seized upon this opening to knowledge. And you know what happened subsequently. But nevertheless, the point I'm highlighting is there was this bridging of boundary, cutting through boundaries and bridging of the inner and outer, and happening on all these physical, vital, mental, and so on. People were yearning for even a spiritual opening. The problem was it stopped short with the false subjectivism. Had it gone on, there would have been spiritual breakthroughs in Germany particularly, and various other parts all over the world where people, groups were so receptive. So men are becoming more psychic, Sri Aurobindo says. And that's happening in a massive way. Remember, 1925. Thirdly, he says, the third sign. Thirdly, the vital is trying to lay its hold on the physical, as it never did before. It is always the sign that whenever the higher truth is coming down, it throws up the hostile vital world on the surface. And you see all sorts of abnormal vital manifestations, such as increase in the number of persons who go mad, earthquakes, etc. Also, the world is becoming more united on account of the discoveries of modern science, the aeroplane, the railways, the wireless telegraph, etc. Such a union is the condition for the higher truth coming down. And it is also our difficulty. Interesting. If you consider just this point, the integration of the world has never been so integrated as it is today, in every way, not just in the ability to contact, to travel, to communicate, and with the internet as we are meeting right now, literally people sitting across countries, cities, towns, different homes, and yet we are together in a way, in consciousness, in spirit, in a focus of interaction, immediately, instantly. And this allows for the higher truth to manifest spontaneously and simultaneously in a collective vessel, which ideally should be as large as humanity. So this is the third thing. But in the third, he's describing the vital world coming up in a reaction to the higher truth, coming forward, and then there are vital manifestations, earthquakes, mental imbalances, and so on. So it's a sign. It's a sign that the higher truth is pushing hard and the vital is resisting or rebelling. But the unification is the positive aspect of it. Then fourthly, the rise of persons who wield tremendous vital influence over large numbers of men. It's a very interesting observation also. And you see from around that period, so many movements beginning. And they're different from the past religious movements, which were founded on some great experience often. These are movements created by persons who wield tremendous vital influence. And it doesn't matter what they teach. Just the charismatic character seizes upon people who gather around and all kinds of things happen. And you look at that today, it's interesting. Though the numbers of such movements have become relatively less, that period was much more rich in a way. Though the numbers have become relatively less, it is still something happening in a big way. Today, the word used for this persons who wield tremendous vital influence, the word used is influencers in social media. So somebody in a social media account has some millions of followers. They put out a message and instantly it hits so many million people. Imagine what an impact that can have if the messages have a spiritual content or a spiritual force behind, even if it's a mental content. Imagine what an impact it can have. And think about how valuable this circumstance would be for the spiritual awakening. So I'm sharing this much more from the point of view of the aspect of number of people who had vital influence, and I'm linking it to a prior discussion regarding what we read of Steiner and others of that time. Now, all this is, remember, these are people now glimpsing something, trying to articulate or manifest, and with a mass influence. So you have large numbers of such people appearing and swinging, moving around, spreading an influence in this way, and as if adding layers on masses, helping people to make small steps in growth. And of course, equally large people who are there to distort or to deflect or even lead people off track. So all this is just to give that big picture. Since this name came up, I thought it's useful to give this picture, and it all links into Maureen's larger question. Which is a proliferation of narratives of all kinds, which seem to be looking at some future possibility. So I think that covers that part of the question. And then the first part of the question is particularly with ET encounters. The thing with ET encounters is it also represents on a deeper subliminal level, an aspiration to encounter things of the inner or higher realms. You see, if an ET comes, it looks just like a human with no difference. He says, I'm an ET. I happen to be living on, let's say, Mars or Venus, or on one of moons of Jupiter, on Europa. But he looks just like you, and you cannot distinguish. You would say, looking at you, well, you seem to have features of some of the people who live in the Nordic regions, but you could have been of Earth. It could just be somebody from the Nordic regions who claims to come from Venus, and you wouldn't know the difference. So nothing special, really. It would be when the person represents a consciousness or a possibility or a culture or something new that is not normally accessible to our Earth experience that we will say, this is what I want. So to answer Maureen's question, the ET encounter has these two components. One, which is an attempt to as if open out to higher, deeper, inner worlds or knowledge to enrich our life. And so often the physical ET becomes a symbol of that. But equally, that in this universalization of the human consciousness is the opening necessary even to a universalization across planets. That it's not just all of us as an Earth who are one family, but all of us sentient beings across all planetary systems across the universe who share in this whole evolutionary urge, isn't it? So that is also a deeper truth, which is, so to say, pressing or influencing the human mind and preparing it for what has to happen inevitably. And for all these things, there have been blocks, barriers, resistances coming from other forces. So I think as a perspective coming from the knowledge that Sri Aurobindo shares, this would be pretty comprehensive as an answer. We have covered the ET aspect, we have covered the predictions from some of these visionaries, we have looked at the science fiction writers, but all of this points to a future, which is waiting because it already exists right here, right now, but in a level of consciousness which is different. From its side, it is actively putting out an influence to assist us. From our side, we feel this yearning, this urge to open out. But the rigidity, narrowness of our receptivity, the gap of our blocked superficial consciousness, these are the barriers or the veils which separate. But the influences are acting, and that's why the bulk of the interaction is occult, that is hidden behind the veil. And yet it influences, and quite powerfully. I think that completes what could be said for the question. We go to the next.
We'll go to Neminem's question. Last week, a person with a mental handicap started going into a trance as he was reading from air. He said that there is a battle going on between two archangels and that this battle is going on in India. This person also said that the battle is already won. In Christian and Hebrew tradition, asuras are fallen archangels. Book of Enoch. This person has knowledge and comes from Christian background. Is there some truth in this experience?
So somebody who had a mental handicap was helped to enter a trance and then described a battle between two archangels and said the battle is won. Of course, it's going on in India. Now, in that trance state, the person opened to a perception, described what was seen in that state, or rather, what was transcribed to his receptive state of a truth that is happening on perhaps other levels. The problem with such transcriptions is that, as I've said already, your vessel, your receptive mind warps what is perceived into fit. Now, this happens to us in a very ordinary, superficial way, and it's so easy in daily life. If you're already pre-programmed, before you go to watch a new movie or read a novel, someone tells you, oh, that is horribly boring. And then you go and watch, the bias is already acting on you, isn't it? But this bias is even more deeply rooted because you have a fixed idea which comes from a religious background, archangels, battle between good and evil, and so on. So when you perceive two forces or two powers or influences in a struggle, you articulate it in these terms, or visualize it in those terms. And sometimes the visioning could be even very detailed. You could describe this archangel looked like that, that archangel looked like that. When in fact the thing happening is in a quality of consciousness which is not limited or bound to form. Yet when it has to be given a form, it tends to acquire certain natural symbolic characters. For example, the divine forces inevitably will tend to become more clear, transparent, white, and so on. Whereas the anti-divine forces will tend to be visioned always in darker or distorted forms. Why? Because the thing they represent is a distortion and a darkening and a clouding or covering. But it doesn't need to be so. The moment that thing, so if you perceive from here to a higher level, you will see it like this. But if that thing now enters the domain of form, it can take on any form. It could be divine or anti-divine, but it could appear as the same form. This is what would happen with Hitler. He's one of those, well, charismatic personalities, we could say, who, as a medium naturally, was channeling a certain force. When that being would appear to him, he would appear as a resplendent, godlike, radiating light of a being. So if you do not have a deeper discrimination, you could say, oh, wow, this is a divine being. And it would give orders. It can, of course, put on any impersonation, as can you as a human being. If you had to dress up, put on any dress you like, appear on stage and pretend to be anyone. So in the domain of form, the form is not naturally representative of the consciousness. But the moment you go to higher gradations, vital, mental, and then of course spiritual, the form is not primary. It is not rigid. Therefore, automatically the perceived form is symbolic or representative of quality of consciousness, which is primary. The vital world would be, of course, of a vital grade, mental of a mental grade, and so on. But this is to tell you, first to explain how that perception is, well, limited as well as revelatory. So the question from Nemenem actually is it true? Is there such a thing going on? If you look at, I would say, any country in the world, and especially those countries which are right now more awake and are attempting to wake up more, you will find this huge collision of forces. Necessarily, there are the forces that resist the future, and there are the forces which want to accelerate the awakening. And of course, there is a collision. It is on many levels. takes many forms. It has many aspects in the play. And in the physical domain, you see it in so many different ways. So, for example, in India, there is right now a huge collective awakening in consciousness to the deeper, I will say, spiritual inheritance of India. It's not even the spirituality lived, it's the inheritance of the spiritual knowledge, consciousness, life, and so on. And there's an opening to that and an attempt for that to awaken and come forward in the national life. And all this while, the national life was dominated by a mix of alien, distorted, and even contrary values. So we had the values which came with certain invasions, which distorted many things. Then you had the values which came with the period of colonization, which distorted things. And the colonization mother speaks of in some strong terms. She says in India, her biggest complaint is, at that time, the enormous inertia in the mind. And she said she had to struggle so much with it. And the blame she put squarely, she said, the colonization period, the British overstayed. You see, they were initially meant to leave in 1921-22. They had come to the negotiating table. And one of the leaders, very charismatic again, turned that whole negotiation around and said, we do not want independence. First, we demand that, and then he asked for some political, religious demands of certain groups, which laid the seeds for the division of India, you see. The result was that time of independence was delayed by 25 years almost. The period of that sustained influence of an alien, mind-numbing educational system designed to numb the mind. It was, I think, one of the declared objectives of the educational system and the creators to make India a nation of clerks. And so the system was made to suffocate and bind the mind. That lasted one extra generation, too long. The result of which is that much more time to come out of it. And that is happening now. Particularly, I will say the last 15 years, there has been a greater awakening. The last 8 years, even more. And there's a struggle to find what are the forms that this nation needs to live by. Because all the forms we have today are imported. Sri Aurobindo writes extensively about this, the imported forms and their limitations. And he says it is not so important what form India develops, as long as they're developed indigenously from the natural turn of the Indian mind and its genius. One of the greatest distortions of, let's say, political life in India is, he said, the parliamentary system. As a parliamentary system, Sri Aurobindo observes, it has only worked in England, which is a very small country. And he quotes Napoleon saying it's a nation of shopkeepers. It worked there because it's small enough. But everywhere else in Europe, Sri Aurobindo says, it has brought Europe to its sorry pass. And in India, it is, of course, one of the biggest reasons for the failure of the whole political framework itself. Now, all this is to tell you that all this being imposed for so long that the culture has forgotten what it was like before. And of course, it has forgotten going back 1,000 years, so there's no real memory. But there's a deeper memory of the civilization, which is as if present, felt intuitively. Behind that, there is the spiritual truth, which those forms represented. And those forms are not to be replicated now, because you need to have new forms relevant to today's consciousness. And so through two layers, that higher truth has to, so to say, reflect. And for that, first thing on the superficial part, at least people have to start thinking freely, not be bound to these forms. But the legal systems are entrenched, political systems are entrenched, educational systems are entrenched, administrative governance, everything else is entrenched. While you may shake up a little bit superficially on the social side, and India is very flexible in that way, you see how rapidly it has adapted to social changes, no problem there. These systems, because they are systems, have a tendency to assert and continue longer than they need to. And so there's a huge strain being built up. One of the forms in which this strain represents itself in our life is people bypass the system. So it started in the colonial period, where to survive, because you had taxation going up 90%, you had to cheat to avoid the excessive taxation, with which, of course, nothing could work. Something of that continued all the way to the 90s until there was this so-called liberalization. Till then, the taxations were so high that if you did not cheat, you could not make a profit. And so no business would work if you didn't cheat. You had to cheat. Cheat what? Cheat a falsehood. So it was not, it was in a way, it was a truth to survive. But nevertheless, that became part of the culture. So today, when certain systems have reasonably loosened up that you don't need to cheat, there's still this tendency, oh, can I? And I can see in people this turning to say, yes, it's a relief to not have to cheat, but can I trust? There's this hesitation. Very interesting to see that. But naturally, the turn is, of course, I don't want to cheat, but can I trust? The doubt is there. So there are many such transitions taking place. It's a fascinating period, but the resistance is equally entrenched and strong because systemic. And then there are people who were formed by that system who become repositories of the resistance, powerful repositories. Imagine a Supreme Court judge passing an order, using some arcane, outdated laws to justify his order, which has national implication and suppresses a mass aspiration. Yes, it happens. It's happening right now. But that's the way the entrenched system works. And so, yes, there is a battle, there's a struggle in terms of energies, in terms of consciousness, ideals, and of course, behind that, spiritual forces. What this person saw, going back to Neminen's question, I cannot say what level it was, but a glimpse of this tension. But what is interesting is the person already saw that the battle is already won. Yes, over there it is won, but it filters down level by level, all the way down until it reaches the more material level. So as it enters the mental domain, you'll find sudden shifts taking place in large numbers of people, in their thinking, in their aspirations. Suddenly they find as if a shackle placed on the thought process that prevented them from thinking, or that brought fear to think in certain ways. Suddenly that is lifted. I can think more freely. You will experience that. Then it comes down to a vital level, and now I can feel more freely, and then I can act more freely eventually. So there's this whole process of descent taking place from a victory won. To go back to the example of the mother, 1920, Sri Aurobindo and the mother, who were working continuously for the liberation of India, for the independence from colonial rule, 1920, they were working on the plane which we may call the overmental, which is just below the supramental plane, where you're acting on a consciousness which is infinite, but there are infinities and aspects of infinities. On that level, they're working with the influence of the supramental consciousness, of course. And then while they're doing this, it's how you do that is a very interesting experience. You're as if living in the consciousness and then shaping the consciousness and pushed. And then the breakthrough takes place, and mother said, it is done. India is free. Sri Aurobindo asks, how? How did it happen? Was there much bloodshed? You see, the concern was that it should not happen with too much suffering or destruction. And that was their effort. And mother says, no, they went as they came. And she explains that the world situation changed and the same British could not stay anymore. They were forced to leave. Now, of course, in India, in the, let's say, constructed history of a political party, they will say Mahatma Gandhi stood up one day and said, quit India, and they left. No, it was not like that. There was a huge struggle going back decades to push, to fight the British. The suffering and the sacrifices built it up to a point where people were sufficiently awake. And then the Second World War changed the situation where the British needed India's help. And they could not manage both. And that was the point where they offered, and this was Sri Aurobindo's influence, the Cripps mission, which would allow India to get free without division, which was again opposed by Gandhiji, and therefore we had the partition. So all this is to say that an event achieved on that spiritual plane, 1920, the first attempt actually 1921-22, they came to the negotiating table, and that's where Mahatma Gandhi said, no, we don't want freedom. We want that you give the right to our Muslim brothers to have their Turkish Caliph as their head, as a religious and political head. Now, it was the most ridiculous thing. Setting aside the demand for freedom to allow a Muslim community to have an extra national authority as their religious and political head is the most ridiculous thing. It split India immediately, and Sri Aurobindo says it made the Muslims a separate political force, where earlier they were equally integrated in the attempt for India's independence. But you see, these are the forces. A very charismatic, powerful personality, well-intentioned perhaps, but open to suggestions, and it warps something. And they're unconscious. They don't even know that what they're doing at that moment it will be so harmful. But it had to go through all those things. It took 25 years for it to come down. So again, coming back to the description and the question, yes, the battle is won up there. It is won. And we are not speaking of India's freedom, because we are speaking now of something more. The awakening in India. It has been won. And in fact, for those who are sensitive enough, one may say in the last couple of years at least, one can feel the influence entering the minds of the people. People are suddenly beginning to feel free, or I would say more free, to think, yes, at least we can have a different political system. We can have a different way of living than this alien artificial system, which has failed. Mother spoke of this. She said that the present system, which was party-based governance, had to go because it was outdated. And increasingly, it will be individuals who can be trusted, who will be not bound to parties, who will be the way forward. And that is again something you see very interesting in India. Young leaders with a clear mind, with a powerful ability to articulate, uncompromising in their idealism, are coming up and are being allowed to enter positions of power. Earlier, such people would be sidelined by the existing power structure. Now they're at least being allowed, and that itself is a huge shift. And what I would dare say is, because India is representative of the world, and this is something Mother spoke of, these shifts happening in India will have spontaneously ripple effects of similar patterns everywhere in the world. Sometimes there's a gap. Sometimes it seems to be simultaneous, but sometimes there's a gap of a few years. But that awakening, as it takes place, you will find the ripple happening everywhere. People are awakening. There are new political leaders coming up who have different values, who are uncompromising, who do not belong to the old way of politics as a pastime, or politics as a way of earning money, or as a way of asserting your power. They come with an idealism to serve, and they are competent and capable in ways which exceed the norm. And this is happening. So all this is the result of, let's say, a battle won, or many battles won on higher levels, which then percolate down and allow these shifts to take place. So is there some truth to this experience? Yes, of course. And India is in a way the last great battleground. And I don't mean necessarily in the sense of a physical war. The mother made a comment about this. She said that one of these great asuras that she was, well, working to neutralize, even finally declared that the last battle will take place. I don't know if he said in India or over India, but the idea is that it is in this space that this key transition of human consciousness can take place most easily. And I want to elaborate on this. Sri Aurobindo makes this observation that in Europe, whenever there have been great revolutions, the result of the revolution was a radical change in external appearances, but internally, in consciousness terms, nothing had really changed. We see this, for example, with the French Revolution or many of the great transitions of battles or ages. Internally, not much changed, and that still took time gradually to change. But the revolution didn't change internally. In India, though, he says, when revolutions take place, there's a huge shift internally, although externally you don't see much has changed. And then he says, therefore, when India becomes once again the theater of the world's most important events, it will be the sign of the coming of the spiritual age. Very interesting, the therefore. You can think about it, the many profound implications. But the nature of the battle here is an inner awakening. And when that happens, externally the forms, of course, will change, but it may not seem to be radical. But whatever they may be, the shift will be so dramatic or drastic in the inner consciousness that it will have a massive ripple effect on the whole of humanity. And we are seeing that. We're seeing that on the verge, so to say. Many small shifts have taken place already. I could give just one example. Just in 2 years, the mass of India has shifted to payment systems which are virtual. Almost as if you can go to the villages and you have a QR code and you can make a payment just like that. And this is, remember, a population of what, 1.2 billion or so. Within 2 years has shifted and cash transactions are minimized dramatically, and everyone is comfortable with it. It does not feel odd. It does not feel strange. You just go and you can as if do this anywhere and everywhere, and people are just adapted to it. That's a huge internal shift in consciousness. Externally, we're still making the same transactions. You're using a mobile phone. It's not dramatic in that sense. Actually, it is dramatic in terms of what it represents, but it's just happened just like that in 2 years or less. There are other many such smaller shifts taking place. But the biggest shift is this inner awakening of the sense of I and the civilizational spiritual values which now come forward and say, these are the values by which I want to live. And at that point, the external unchanging structures which are resistant are so false, so warped, that they either just crumble or they undergo some shifts. It does not look dramatic, but they have just shifted in such a way that, oh, okay, now the new consciousness is able to freely act. It's on the verge of something of that kind. And that's why Sri Aurobindo says this will be the sign of a coming spiritual age. But that's also why this resistance is so much greater. And it's, so to say, the last great battle. Of course, spiritually, there's a great truth to the fact that it has been won. But the ripple effect, of course, you can say a series of victories down as it comes down to the more physical level. Okay, that's with the second question. We can, I think, end with the third.
Yes, we will go to Nishikant's question. Sometimes I hear intuitive voices and visions in my dream during around 4 to 6:30 a.m. in the morning. Most of the time it comes true. On 21st February 2022, I saw some kind of military artillery deployment in 2 visions. When I was viewing, I said to myself, oh, it's a dream vision. Perhaps it was related to the recent war going on in Ukraine. Does it signify any kind of opening of higher faculties of the mind? Where do these dream visions and intuitive voices come from, or the plane where it is formed, and how I can be more aware of such vibrations?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So all of us, without exception, have a part that is open to the spiritual in our higher ranges. We are close to those parts, but the parts exist. All of us have these inner ranges of the inner mind, inner vital, opening out to the universal mind. They are open, we are closed to them, but they are a part of us, so to say. And therefore, these visions, intuitions, perceptions of the future are all the while reflected in those inner and higher parts. Only we are blind to them. Whatever happens in those inner or higher parts does influence us through reflections, through layers. Depending on how many layers are blocked, you have more dilution because it goes through many more layers. Or if occasionally some of us have these little holes, so to say, which Mother referred to earlier, little concentrated narrow passage, something leaks through and it pops up like that in the more surface parts of our consciousness, or at least the layers closer to the surface, which are typically what we pass through in our dream state. And so something pops up. Which one pops up? Either which was very strong in insistence or which we were more aligned to. So somebody who's more politically keen to know what is happening around the world will tend to pick up things of that type. Somebody who is more artistically oriented and wants to create or manifest in art will be more open to those types, and so on. So either the thing is insistent or you are naturally more receptive to a type. So that comes through and pops up. It's interesting in the question, he notes it is between 4 a.m. and 6:30 in the morning that most of these dream visions occur. There's a good reason for that. When we go into sleep, it's as if our consciousness goes deep in the inner layers, all the way to the inner higher. Eventually, Mother describes it touches momentarily the Satchidananda, a tiny part of your consciousness. It's not you, a part of your consciousness, which is most refined, most essential, briefly touches the Satchidananda for 2 or 3 seconds, she says. And that's the thing which makes you fresh when you wake up. And then the rest of the night is spent in the return. And in the return, it's as if you're passing through layer by layer by layer by layer, all the way to the most physical. In the approach to the most physical, you are passing through the part of the mind that is closest to the physical, vital closest to the physical, and sometimes the subtle physical itself. And it's in those layers what you perceive as dream or vision experience are the things which are closest to materialization. In the layers before, you might glimpse many possibilities. Doesn't mean they'll come true because there's still a long way for them to materialize. But the closest are the ones which are already close enough to the material that they are likely to happen. And this is why there is this saying in the yoga tradition that dreams of early morning tend to come true. Or in this case, the registration of these dream visions tend to come true because they are already close enough to the material. So this is understanding the principle. Now this happens to all of us. The majority of us, we just don't remember. Or what we remember may be some fragments here and there. And often what we remember is already distorted in the receptive base of the waking mind, which reduces to form. Now I've had a few interesting experiences of this kind, which I will share only to illustrate what actually happens in that dream state. So there was a time when there was once when I was in deep dream state, and there was a physical provocation on the body that forced the waking from a very deep dream state. So at the moment where I was waking up, I had full recall of the dream as it was happening, and generally as it happens, you lose it afterwards. But what I recalled was 3 different dreams. And because I was working consciously to try to recall dreams, I made it a point to recall each of these dreams. What was fascinating was, there was one dream where I was, I think, in a hall and something, I was going somewhere. And in that dream, the end of the dream is this physical discomfort which wakes me up. There's another dream, which now I don't recall, I had noted it at that time, that's happening certain events, and it ends with the physical discomfort waking me up. And there's a third dream where I'm as if sitting on a plane which is completely open, almost like a car which has no cover, and we're taking off, and there's a tension because the plane is not picking up, and I feel the tension, and it links to the body sensation that wakes me up. 3 dreams, all 3 ending with the same body sensation. And I said, how is this possible? So in the normal memory, I would have recalled the first dream as previous, then the second, then the third. But in fact, because the detail of all three ended with the body sensation, I realized that I was actually experiencing three dreams on three different levels at the same time. And if there was not the clear ending with the body sensation as the link, I would have woken up and said, first I had that dream, which is now faint, then this dream, which is less faint, and then this. Because the physical mind translates into its terms. Very interesting. And this is, of course, in many other ways. There was another time when I was working to recall dreams. I was rich three-dimensional experience. There was a very distinct color that I was noticing. And then I woke up, and as I woke up, the image became gray until it was gray colored. So at the waking consciousness, that color was reduced to the closest that the surface mind could hold, which was a gray. Which is why many people have the illusion that their dreams take place in black and white. No, they don't. They are in rich color, far richer than the physical. But when you translate to the physical mind, there is no equivalent. So it gets reduced to your receptacle, which is too narrow to hold the richness of those colors. There are many such experiences one could recall and compare the two or the various worlds or dream states or experiences in these worlds. But all this is to show you that actually what takes place is so rich, but what you recall or what the physical mind reduces to is so flat. And that's the biggest problem of dream recall. So many things which were experienced in quality of consciousness are now reduced to form of consciousness. I remember another time it was sitting in a space which was like a theater where you had these long round benches, but they were as if partitions of seats. And I was in a consciousness in which I was taking 2.5 seats, and somebody else was taking so many, but they were not physical boundaries of number. So when I woke up from there, I had distinct recall my consciousness was spread over 2.5 seats. You see, in a physical body, that can't happen, although the image was of seats. And so if I could go back behind the image, I could feel the pure experience of consciousness with consciousness in the environment of consciousness. I could get back to that. Yes, this was the true nature of the dream, which on waking up got translated into this seating area and my sitting on 2.5 seats and other people on other seats. You see? So the recovery of the memory of dream is the reduction into surface physical mind, is the term Mother uses. And therefore with it, loss of the real character of the dream. So now coming back to this question, yes, of course, 4 to 6:30, now we understand why those dreams would tend to represent physical events, possibilities as well as actual events. It took place on 21st February, which was the day when official war started from Russia and Ukraine, and military deployment, which he perceived in the visions. In the collective consciousness of humanity, those events would have a very strong imprint. Because in the collective consciousness, as a species or as a collective mind of the earth, we sense in advance strong pressures, strong collisions, or even shocks which might come on our consciousness. We sense them. At that point, you may not be able to distinguish where and what. If you had clear recall of the dream, you might even see certain forms in the military deployment and the faces, and you will feel a quality of consciousness that would say, Russia. But that's about it. And then you would have to validate after waking up. Yes, definitely that dream was related to that. So is it an opening of the higher faculties of the mind? Yes, but whether the opening is a continuing opening or just a narrow hole passage, which is existent already and not growing much more, that is for you to sense. Do you find that the clarity of these perceptions is growing? That's a sign that it is growing. But for some people, it's as if it's inborn ability. You have a narrow hole or passage linking the inner and outer mind or vital. And so you keep getting these glimpses or perceptions, but it stops with this narrow passage. With yoga, you have a conscious opening for the full wideness, not a narrow passage. And when that is complete, in waking state, you can simply concentrate, shift within, and access that. Or even if it goes through layers, on waking up from the dream state, you have a sense of continuity when it's fully bridged. But initially, there are little passages like tunnels or little holes and or threads, as if you feel them like that. That's all it is. But one can develop, and the method would be very simple. If you are conscious, and all goes back to this, if you're conscious of this part within you, which has this opening to an intuition, let's say, you become aware of it, and you stay concentrated aware of it until it becomes more vivid. And then it's as if your surface mind opens like a container to receive. And there's a point where you lean back, as if you lean back to rest or allow yourself to dissolve, to open to that. So it's a slow process in that sense. You stay in this, and then bit by bit, it's as if a bridge is built. Mother speaks of a gap in her consciousness, which was at the level of the vital, which is a grade which is very close to the natural and the energy in nature. And she was working the whole year to bridge that gap. And then one day she went into the countryside, weekend, and she lay down on the grass in the garden, just like that. And instantly, poof, the whole thing bridged, and that whole domain opened up, and that was it. But she said the struggle of work took about a year. Of course, the point where finally the bridge was made seemed almost instant. But this is just to show you that you continue like this persistently and opening, but you have to let go of your mind's way of thinking, become completely still and quiet, and open out and allow that to infuse and this to receive, and the two to blend into each other. This is the method broadly describing. You can, of course, review what we have described about developing the intuition and so on, where the 4 stages or 4 steps are described in more detail. But you can thus open to these higher ranges of consciousness. I wouldn't say really faculties, you can call them faculties of perception, which are natural to the higher consciousness, but now they, so to say, become accessible, and they join over or overlay your lower perceptions. And wherever the origin was, need not always be intuitive, as in this case, it could have been in the mental plane. Remember, the soldiers who are already going out to the battlefront are fully tuned in, and they've been preparing for days, weeks, perhaps. And so the energies have already aligned. And on the other side, the energies are also building up. And so there's a collision of energies already begun on that level before the physical contact takes place in matter. And you're sensing those. So it could be from the vital, it could be from the mental, where the plans and the intentions are being formulated and have been sufficiently materialized, or it could be from an intuitive. It could be any of these levels. All depends on the grade in which you perceived. And again, you will know by observing the quality of consciousness. So this whole exploration of the inner world is something very rich and wide and fascinating in exploration, which we have to open to eventually, if we want the completeness of the awakening and the realization of our full potential. I think that would cover enough for the question from Nishikant. So I will now go back. It's time for us to close. So I'll go back to the sum total of these 3 questions and the common thread which was there among all 3. That there are things, and I've titled it Visions of the Future, but there are things which represent a higher possibility, which are already pushing down, preparing to manifest, assembling material, organizing themselves through the planes all the way down to the material. Those of us who are more receptive and open can glimpse them long before. We can also assist them, if that is our need or intention, to assist them to manifest in our minds, in our emotions, in our bodies, in our circumstances. So we become, so to say, points of light to articulate even a divine possibility. We are not too interested in intermediate possibilities. The divine possibility and their perhaps intermediate aspects, which is fine. But each one of us tends to be like a receptacle, aligned to certain aspects because I'm turned this way, or rigid in flexibility of receptivity, or closed to other aspects. And that is why the necessity for being able to open entirely and exclusively to the divine. I'm going to give here an interesting example. Sri Aurobindo records. You see, when he had some contact with Annie Besant, she was also working for India's freedom, and they were very strong. There's a lot of appreciation Sri Aurobindo makes describing what kind of a person she was like. And all of these, I think you will enjoy reading. They're, of course, available already, but you'll enjoy reading in the upcoming biography of Sri Aurobindo, which was written by my teacher, M.P. Pandit, from a spiritual and intimate and personal perspective, that will be released on his birthday on June 14th. So do take a look at that. And he has recorded and documented all these in one place, so it makes it more interesting. So there, in that whole description, he appreciated Annie Besant, of course, in wonderful ways. But there's a point he makes when somebody called Muttayan, who was secretary of the local Theosophical Lodge, had come to visit Sri Aurobindo when he first came to Pondicherry. Sri Aurobindo told him, and this is the actual quote as recorded by him, both Annie Besant and I had the same vision. I interpret it in one way and she in another. Interesting. So the vision of what was seen for the work to be done and the whole new next step in human evolution, she also glimpsed that, the same vision. And he was conscious that it was the same vision, you see. But the interpretation, the way you receive, the way you perceive, the way it translates into your receptive consciousness was different. So in a sense, you can say what she was doing was fully aligned with the work that Sri Aurobindo was doing, but its form, its focus, its articulation might have been different. And I'm highlighting this to show you that each one of us, as an instrument, with whatever our limitations, as we open to the divine influence, what manifests may be complete, but we catch an aspect which is more aligned to us. We should also recognize others catch aspects more aligned to them. And so we may feel affinity in the ideal or in the larger goal, but in the forms we may feel differences of emphasis, of priority, even sometimes of articulation, and they may seem to be conflicting. Perhaps they do appear to conflict in the way we articulate. But if we go behind the form and try to touch what is the intuition or the inspiration behind, we may find that they're perfectly aligned. Especially for those of us who are working in the spiritual aspiration in the field of life. It's very important to distinguish between these two. And when you can recognize, even if forms are different, that the intuition or the inspiration or the central ideal is common, do not worry about these differences on the surface. They are not important. There may be a collision here even, but remember, this is the parallel line of aspiration. And if we can free ourselves from the rigidity of the form, then there is no collision, there is complementarity. There is no opposition, there is mutual support and help in completely different fields, but we find each is nourishing the other. I cannot do what he could do, he cannot do what I could do, but together we are completing something larger. And maybe if we have a larger vision, we see maybe hundreds or a few thousands, some unconscious, some conscious, aligned to that vision and working together for the same thing. And seeing that, recognizing that deeper truth behind, even if you see differences on the surface, align on that. And this way, the deeper inner spiritual harmony will unify us. Even if you use vocabularies which are different, recognize the goal and that we are all working for that goal. So this is what I would describe as the collective vessel through which the more complete ideal works, sometimes through our fragments of differences or gaps or separations or even conflicts. But if this can be our background, we will avoid the conflicts and build complementarities and strong affinities. Very important to recognize this, especially in spaces like Auroville, in the ashram, in the various centers, and just among us individually. That's why there's this line in Savitri where Sri Aurobindo describes how opening to the Divine Mother, we find our unity with all. And then there's this other beautiful line, all aims were lost in her, then found in her. We have to as if go through that passage. I want to do this, I need to do this, this is my goal, this is my ambition, this is my whatever. Well, at some point, as you open to the Divine Mother, you lose them all. When you're free of all those aims, then you discover the aims once again, but no more as yours, but as her working in you, through you, and in all others. And so the same goals are found in her, but now in an affinity, in an alignment, in a spontaneous, effortless harmony. Keep this in mind and let this be our conscious effort to align to her and to unify in the manifestation of the Divine Mother and her work on earth, in us and through us. We can close with a concentration on this